Color Wizards, Hajra here. Today we're going to be working on a Brunaille value underpainting of Penelope from the Odyssey, and it's based on a statue that I saw at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. So this is just an original piece that I'm working on. If you Google Penelope, you'll be able to find it even on Wikipedia, because this is a very famous statue, or at least it's iconic when it comes to Penelope from the Odyssey, who is Ulysses' wife, or Odysseus' wife. Larger than life-size statue that they have, and I think it was made in like the late 1800s. Such a sober, morose look she's got, you know. She sits there and waits for what, 20 full years for her husband to get back. Share the color wheel first. So this is a old Masters Triad. I chose 3 colors, and they were Naples Yellow Reddish, transparent brown or red oxide, and also a Cobalt Turquoise, because I wanted to have this very old Greek Roman look to it. So I wanted to make sure that I brought the intensity down. But you can see I've arranged my palette the same as I have arranged my color wheel and my paper. Again, something I say to my students, you know, make sure you have your color wheel and your palette mimicking each other. And I also have this stand-in for yellow that is not a vibrant yellow, and also a stand-in for red that's not a vibrant red. And when you bring that intensity down, you get more of a limited mood and color scheme, and this is what you call an old Masters Triad. And I know that more people are aware of it now, but if you want to check out a really great book on covering these old Masters Triads, I would really highly suggest Nita Leland's books on color and color schemes and color theory. She does a really good job with explaining that in a way that I never saw other people do that, and I think most people have just copied that right out of her books when they're explaining it. Working on the Brunaille value underpainting. That's going to be the value underpainting for this whole piece. So I'm going to do this in brown first and then come over it with the colors. So in the Grisaille class that we did I think 9 variations of the different underpaintings. One of them was the Brunaille, and that includes browns, reds, oranges, and yellows as your value underpainting. Here you can see that it makes a real difference in the mood and the end color when you choose, say, gray value underpainting, the Grisaille, versus a Brunaille, which is brown. So you end up having a very neutral shadow that really pops and has some cleanliness. Alex Ross, when he paints his comic book paintings, he uses a lot of black for that reason, versus having a Brunaille, which will give you a very warm, you know, candlelit, natural light look. I also did a quick thumb, and sometimes I can do like 2 or 3 or 4, but sometimes I'll stop right after one because I kind of know where I want my colors. So in this case, you can see this really ugly egg-shaped person kind of just sitting in this chair, but that's all I really needed, because what I wanted to do is show that maybe this mix of the yellow and the Cobalt Turquoise I wanted to have in the background as that pale green, give her a blue dress, blue headband, you know, there's the skin color coming in with the Naples Yellow Reddish, and also the throne, the lion's rug that's drawn down here, you know. So all these things that I sort of wanted to figure out how I wanted them as far as color. Some of them are fixed, right, because I'm not really going to make this into a blue lion's robe or a blue chair. I mean, I could, but that's not really my intention. So I sort of had some fixed colors, and it sort of played off as a result of that. I've got an angle brush, and I've got a Nova flat brush. I've also got a 1 round and a quadruple 0 tiny round or spotter, and those are the 4 that I'm going to be using right now. They're all synthetic. You can of course use a sable or squirrel hair. I do have them, but when I tend to work on a face this small, so just for perspective, here's my pencil tip, and you can see that it's a very small face. It's probably 3/4 of an inch tall, so try to use smaller brushes that don't carry as much water when you're working on really tiny faces. That's my advice. But we're going to be doing this Brunaille value underpainting first, which means we're going to be using basically the transparent brown red oxide first, and that's going to go over the entire thing, so you can sort of learn how I'm applying the paint and shading. These are all Schmincke watercolors, by the way. The other 2 are Cobalt Turquoise and Naples Yellow Reddish. And I think the Naples Yellow Pure is, you know, when it doesn't have a reddish hue. You can use whatever way of distributing water to your palette you like. You can spray bottle it in, you can use a water dropper, or you can use a squeeze bottle. But having that little bottle there is handy, because you can sort of have a measured amount of water going into your pans, just like with a water dropper. So I kind of prefer that, the squeeze bottle or the water dropper, because unlike spraying your pans or just lugging in some water on the brush, it does let you know exactly how much water you're bringing in. And I like to actually put a little bit of extra water in the middle there, so if I ever want to dilute some of my paint as I'm working and get like a really sheer glaze, I have the stronger paint on this side, and then I've got basically just mostly water in the center there. So I'm going to wet this neck area first, This is a rather staining color. It doesn't really lift up very well once it's down. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm working on paper, like, I mean, this is Arches, so luckily it can withstand a lot of water. This is the back of a cold press 140-pound Arches watercolor paper. And again, I sort of chose this because I like the smoother side, and my favorite would be hot press, but I've said this to students before, which is that the hot press is definitely harder. It's an acquired taste, so if you are trying to just learn watercolor, then maybe start with the cold press. If you like less texture, then you can use the back like I am here. And at this point, I'm just using it because I have it in this size. This is a convenient size. I think it was 7 by 10. That tends to be when I do full body portraits. I tend to go up to 7 by 10 size because it's a good size for me as far as being able to render. And I've said this also to students, is if you need to do it 9 by 12, you need to do it 12 by 18, do whatever size is comfortable for you to manipulate the paint. I just thought to myself, if I can get the face done without messing it up, then the rest of the painting will be smaller and not as hard to finish, instead of like huge folds of fabric everywhere if I did this painting larger. So that's always my incentive for painting smaller, is it gets it done faster. And if you have health issues like I do, and even if you're just on a schedule or have limited storage space, then it's a good idea to maybe have a smaller size painting. So just try to not pay attention too much to the fact that it looks really weird, but just follow the folds and try to just pursue the gestalt of it, you know, divide it up into the different parts and abstract jigsaw pieces and move forward from that. I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing about learning the tiling method as well, is that tiling is actually a great way to practice gestalt. Just like grisaille is a great way to practice value rendering and paying attention to values. So both of these different techniques done for different types of mediums. You know, grisaille is for a transparent sheer glazing medium application, and tiling is more for an opaque medium application. And most of the times people don't know the difference, and I can see people all the time, sometimes even people who are popular illustrators, who don't quite know the differences between these techniques and how to use them, and so they're sort of guessing a bit here and there. And I don't think there's anything wrong with improvising when you don't have that, but if you do have the luxury of perhaps figuring out how these things work, then it is a good idea to try to figure out how these things, how the different terms and different techniques are actually meant to be used, and then after that sort of bend and break the rules how you'd like, you know. But I think a lot of people miss out by not knowing how it actually works. All of these colors on this side, every single one of them up to here, has a little bit of the brown in it already. When I get over to this side, this is where I have to be careful. And even then I'm going to be okay with a little bit of the shadow muddiness happening if I want shadows on it, because I don't want it to be so bright that it sort of stands out and makes no sense in the painting. It has to match the mood and color scheme. So in a way, this Brunaille is actually going to unite this entire piece and painting with that similar color going underneath most of the areas. And so as a result of that, it's a unifying color keynote that you end up getting here. Another term that we learned in the color theory class. Something that's going underneath it and harmonious throughout the entire painting. And you could also do the same thing over the top, right? So over the top, if you painted it a glaze, but if you went over the entire thing in a glaze, then that would be a color key over the top. That would unify the painting if it was discordant. So either way.
Is there any difference between those two approaches?
Well, in one, you're studying the values from the beginning, so you're getting this in so you can do your drawing in a particular color, and that way you are choosing the color with the final colors in mind, but you're doing this initial part of it so you can have values that look realistic to you and are separated from the color stage and step to make it easier for you. Whereas when you do it all over the top, as a single color, it's basically to change the color tone. So you might say, oh, this is too bright, I'm going to bring it down, or this is too red, I want to make it more blue, or whatever it is. So then as long as it's a glazing medium, you can do that over the top. But yeah, it is dependent on what your intention is. I sort of scooped it out. If you make your pan wet and let it sit for a second, you can use a palette knife to scoop out paint from the center. And I've done that before when I need a large amount of paint, and everybody who knows me knows I don't like tubes of paint, so therefore that's how I scoop a large amount of paint out of my pans. But yeah, you can do a Brunaille or grisaille with a staining transparent watercolor just as well as you can with Inktense. Now just make sure you use something that is not opaque and lifting, because you want it to stick, right? So if it is lifting, then you're totally defeating the purpose of putting it in first, because it's going to be a darker color and it's going to give you trouble. This is one of the reasons why, unless you know how to use it, you probably shouldn't do that first, because otherwise you'll end up with a muddy mess later. And one of the golden rules there is make sure you have a transparent staining color. So that's what transparent brown is. That's right in the name. Luckily, it was a color I happened to own, and I liked it. I actually chose the colors this time, like I said, based off of the mood. I wasn't doing a study of the statue. I wanted to do a study of Penelope, but based off of the entire statue. And so that's why I made up my own background and, rendered more things, in a different way instead of just copying the statue. It actually would be easier just to leave it that plain because there's less work there. But similarly with the curls, I actually really like that they're really tight curls like that. So I'm going to try to leave them that way. But you see how that's very loosely rendered? You could also go in that direction too, which is make it really loose. So I'm not entirely sure how I want to go for this one, but I'm going to sort of leave the option open as I play with the curls, because I did like the idea of having those tightly rendered curls because it makes it look so Grecian. So I don't know if I want to make it'll look more like a Regency hairstyle the more I sort of loosen it out, or like a Gibson girl era. I am doing still a wet and dry combo, which is I keep sort of taking one of those edges to keep it from looking harsh, and then wetting it down. And I'm going to continue to do that as I build up the hair. I try to, in a piece like this, reserve the white of the paper as my highlights because I'm doing it all in transparent watercolor. And usually it works out, but you shouldn't kill yourself. So if it doesn't work out, then you can always go ahead and switch over to a little bit of white gouache to rescue those highlights. There's no shame in that. I do think that with enough practice, though, that tends to become easier and easier to do, which is that you can use just transparent watercolor. I found that if you scrub with a synthetic brush like this one on its side, you can lift even a really staining color. It's such a pleasant earthy brown. It's almost like a terracotta color, and I think that's why I chose it, is because of the browns that I had. Could you give me that Schminke color wheel real quick? I want to show them what I mean by that. It's in that top drawer. Here's where it shows the Naples Yellow reddish. So here's the Naples Yellow, and here's the Naples Yellow reddish. See how much more red and orangey that is? And when you looked at the browns down here, if you look at the earth one, it's also opaque, even though it's staining, versus a transparent brown is semi-opaque and it's very staining. So that's why I chose this for a grisaille color, because it's not going to be as lifting as much, right? And I wanted to choose this Cobalt Turquoise because it just really looked so old world to me, It'd be a perfect color also if you're painting something out of like Egypt or, old Persia or something, It's just such a beautiful color, that Cobalt Turquoise. Painting takes time, and part of it is a prerequisite is that you enjoy it. You get some meditation out of it, or you enjoy studying the subject and learning about it. If you're not going to enjoy it, then you're probably not going to get very much out of it. I've actually noticed that if you scrub at this drawing with the brush, you can even pull the pencil up. The pencil gets pulled up too. So that's how well lifting works, She does have a headband here, in this area, and it sort of goes further back into that area before the hair sort of shows up. And so I'm going to sort of leave that to, I'm going to guesstimate where it sort of stops and starts. I think it's going to be like right around there. So it's okay if I leave it loose. Yeah, I love these old Masters Triads, and I think that's why I started using them like, I don't even remember now, like 6 years ago. Ever since I read about them in Nita Leland's books, I was really excited about trying them out, because instead of doing the digital way of where you have the full color wheel and then you sort of have to pick from the color wheel where you're going to go in, from the center, or choose a slice of it, a color gamut, it's actually a very different way of getting to that gamut, So I actually really like the idea of starting out by neutralizing the colors to begin with, and that way you don't have to have a full key color wheel and then figure out how to go towards the center from there. It sort of does that for you, and it sets the mood when you make these color wheels. I make color wheels like this for every original piece at least, and sometimes for studies as well, but definitely for originals where you want to have the idea of how you're going to be doing your mood and your color and everything. You don't want to just go into it blind, It might save you a little bit of time, but it's not going to, I actually find the color wheel fun, so I don't really feel like it's a big tax on my time either. Yeah, those very tight curls tend to read a little bit unrealistic, but I can always adjust this later. There's going to be many layers of paint that come over the top. There's going to be, highlights that I can throw in. It's never, it's never too late to fix something unless you've literally chewed a hole into your paper. You can actually do lots of things to fix it. It just looks a little bit wiry to me in a way that I feel like might make it look like the head's more of a sculpture. And then maybe also come back in and do some lifting and scraping. But that way we add a little bit more texture to these curls, and they're still going to look rather sculpted, you know, because that's the whole point. They're sculpted, tight curls, and you would see that if somebody was doing a 20s flapper era, Great Gatsby type hairstyles, where if you don't have that little bob in the 20s, the other hairstyle that you see a lot are those really sculpted, sort of wet curls. So I think you want to sort of emulate that here, even though I have no intention of doing the rest of the colors, because like again, I'm doing the Brunaille today. But see, if I put the blue in here, it's an opaque color, so first of all I've got to be careful about stroking it in too thick. But see how when it goes in, it's going to sort of harmonize with that brown a bit. And also it's going to go over that brown and sort of be affected in a shadow color. So you'll get kind of like that shadow color automatically when you're doing it over the brown. You see what I'm doing right there? So again, if you were a student in any of those classes, you saw how we did that with those cherries when we did 9 different renditions of the cherries, and how the different value underpaintings affected the cherries, the final result, because there was always a different color underneath, and as a result of that, the color on top was affected as well.
Any tips for portraits?
Again, I would suggest Andrew Loomis's books on drawing the head and the hands, and also Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, as good books to purchase. And if you want to study portraiture of any sort, realistic portraiture, golden age way of drawing realistically and having that romantic realism and a very beautiful style, that's something that I learned from him. But see how that pop of blue really works well there, but also how it's harmonized with this piece. It doesn't look as garish as it could if I just put it in straight, strength-wise, because it's going a little bit over that brown. So as a result of that, it harmonizes. So that's kind of how it's going to look in all the places where there's a little bit of brown underneath. You know, it's going to have a little bit of that. Yeah, the cherries, it's funny. I think that class ended up running for 4 hours instead of the 3 hours when I got it all done. But everybody stuck around, so that was nice. It was just so many different variations, and I wanted to make sure we got through all of them so everybody got their, you know, their curiosity satisfied and got their money's worth when it came to those classes. Now, remember when I'm coming towards the center of these curls to get that soft edge going, because that's really where the soft edges on hair show up, is that merging between the highlight and the shadow there. It should be a nice soft edge. I might even come back and lose some of the detail. That happens with me sometimes because I tend to put in a lot of tight detail. Sometimes I'll come back in and scrub some of it out, actually. So it depends on what your style is. Some people struggle with getting tighter, other people struggle with getting looser. And so I've always been a strong drafter, and so I always draft and draft and draft and get a lot of detail in, and sometimes I don't need all of it. So you can do a lot of that same communication with implication and suggestion, and also it looks more painterly. So depending on the look you're going for, if it's going to, you know, be more of an illustrative comic book look, or if it's going to be more of a painterly look, you can sort of, you know, figure that out. You may not know, but I stopped teaching at university due to health issues. So I did teach for 4 years, and then once you relocated, I resigned. I really love bringing that sort of organized canon and syllabus way of teaching to other classes when I can teach them. And so I think what I really enjoyed was like having these 4 modules, right? The color theory module, the 5 ways to draw anything module, the tiling and the opaque method module, and also the grisaille, value underpainting, and the sheer glazes module. And because I feel like it covers everything that I would want to teach if I was doing my own art program. If you do those classes, I think that covers everything that I think you would need to know. I have my color wheel, so I have this as a guide to say where I want what. And I also had this ugly little mutilated thumb to show me where I'm going to be painting in this piece, the colors that I have. But what I'm doing now is the Brunaille value underpainting, okay? So again, like I said before, if you took that class and you were there, this is that the brown value underpainting versus the gray grisaille value underpainting, and it gives you a different mood. So depending on your colors, you change your mood, and depending on your underpainting, you change your mood. And if you don't have an underpainting and you're just doing tiling, or if you're doing alla prima in some other way, then your colors will decide your mood.
It says, what do Schminke paints have that others don't? I'm quite curious about.
I mean, to be completely honest, I love Schminke paints because the quality is good, but it really is that those were the first paints I was introduced to when I was learning about watercolor paints, and then after that I just tried lots of other paints and saw which ones I liked more or less. And I have to say I like Schminke Sennelier, and also I think the Magello Mission Gold that Tasha sent in, they're also all comparable in quality. But I think what these paints all share that I like, they also have a very high finely ground pigment load, unlike a lot of the student brands of watercolor. And also they have a really nice soft binder. So it could be the gum arabic and the honey and the ox gall to help dispersion. I mean, if it's Schminke, and if it's Sennelier, it's honey, and if it's the Mission Magello Gold, then it's like a combination of the glycerin, the honey, and the gum arabic. So, you know, it depends on the brand, but I think I like myself a nice soft paint that re-wets easily in the palette and has a really nice pigment load, so it goes really far. And I think I bought these pans from Schminke 10 years ago, all of my pans. I haven't had to refill any of them. And granted, you know, I have not used a lot of these colors. So I have a lot of colors that I'm still, you know, barely getting through, but even the colors I've really dug into. I've illustrated, like, for example, a picture book using just 2 pans when I did a complementary color scheme. And I didn't even dig into maybe, I think, a third of the pan by the time I was done. And so that color really goes a long way. So I think in combination with how soft and easily rewettable the colors are versus something like Daniel Smith, which I like when it's fresh, but when it's in a pan or on a dot card, oh my god, those paints are horrible to re-wet. They don't re-wet easily at all. And same thing for Winsor & Newton. They're not as easy to re-wet as the Schminke and the Sennelier paints. So I think that's why I prefer those 2 brands.
If you were doing this using Inktense, would you be able to correct mistakes at all?
You can, as long as it's wet. If you're, you won't be able to lift and correct with Inktense once it's dried. So because this is watercolor, I have gone back and like sort of been able to shave out some highlights. It happened with this area in the chin where I wanted a little bit more of a reflected rim light going on down there. And that's just a personal choice that I made because I thought it would make it more interesting than how the statue was more sort of simply lit. But yeah, you would not be able to do that if this was Inktense. You can catch it while it's wet or when it's like just put down, but then also you can correct with white on top of Inktense. Now, of course, Inktense is waterproof, so their white is also waterproof. I just like to add white highlights last, whether it's waterproof white or not. I think that's the shorthand. And like I said, I think I'm going to come back and really play at the quality of hair curls here. I might make it looser, I might make it tighter, might throw in some lifting highlights. I'm thinking of doing this part that I threw in, which is like kind of the embroidery on her dress. I sort of tried to do a design that copied that embroidery that's on the sculpture and put it back there. And I think I'm going to do that in copper, metallic copper to make it really sing. I have out, so I'm going to switch to this larger angle. For the larger brushes, I always like the angle because you can still put it on its tiptoe and get it quite small if you need it. And just go ahead and set in the really diluted color into the wet and wet on this side. I had a really tight pencil drawing underneath this. Usually I don't go as tight. I do a lot of the rendering in the paint. It happens every time I do a pencil drawing, is that some of it will inevitably get covered up with the paint. So you're going to have to redraw it anyway in the paint. And so probably one of the best things you can do for yourself is just be comfortable to do it in the paint on its own. That's what I kind of learned. But after a while, it starts to become second nature and also seems even more fun. So for me now, I do prefer rendering in the paint to the pencil. The pencil now feels rather scratchy, even though it's more controlled. So I actually prefer the paint to the drawing and rendering. It's actually easier on my hands if you've got chronic pain. The pencil's a lot scratchier and takes a lot more shading and sort of pressure versus the paint. It doesn't, you know, take very much pressure at all. I mean, it's one of the reasons also why I don't work in something like color pencil, right? Because color pencil also would require a lot of shading and pressure that I don't really have to give with these hands. I just want to make that harmonize. And depending on how something is lit in a photo, it might not come across as dark. And so you have to sort of take artistic license and try to figure out how you're going to shade that. Because remember, if I'm doing this as an underpainting, if I do it so light that it sort of gets lost in the top layer, then why did I even do it? So if you're nervous about that, then maybe don't do grisaille. Maybe just go from light to dark and not have a grisaille value underpainting, because you really have to be brave with these values. And again, it has to be a staining color, and you have to use a light hand. With glazes in general, you have to use a light hand, even if you weren't doing grisaille, because if you really use a heavy hand, it's going to start to lift. I just give that roundness to her shoulder there. And a little bit more on this side. And this is all wet and wet, and the paper has stayed wet, so something that's working in both directions there. I think there might be a lighter spot up on the shoulder that I want to save. And again, while this is still wet, I can come in with the flatter brush and sort of lift out and chisel this a bit more. And try not to scour your paper, because remember, you're going to want to do many layers of paint on it. You don't want to completely beat it up just in the first layers. But if it does happen, then use like a smooth stone or like a bone folder to burnish it flat. And then that actually makes it a little bit more receptive. I hate the way watercolor ground works because it's made out of acrylic basically. So I think just burnish a paper flat with a stone and then, you know, come back in with some gelatin sizing if you've really beat up your paper. But I don't even own any gelatin sizing, so it just shows you that you don't really need some of those things that people say you might need. You can really beat up your paper and it can still sort of recuperate. And if all else fails, then turn it into a gouache piece. I've said that to people before, which is that, you know, if you are working on a watercolor piece and for some reason it didn't work out, well, it looks like it's going to be a gouache piece then. Or an ink piece or something else that you can cover up. It's not written in stone. You can always keep practicing your watercolor in the future, but, you know, you can, at the same time, be merciful to yourself and say, well, if this is not working in watercolor, then maybe I can switch to gouache. Or at least gouache highlights for corrections, you know? So like a mixed watercolor and gouache piece. And some people do that on purpose to begin with anyway, so it's not much of a stretch. She's sitting there looking so sort of sad and morose and somber. It just really appealed to me, and I love the Odyssey. I love her character. I love Greek myths. I love fairy tales and folk tales and myths in general. It's part of the reason why I wanted to be a writer when I was younger, is I had this great love for all of these old folk tales and fairy tales and just really wanted to do my own versions of them. There's a sphinx there, the different embroidery that sculptor put into the dress there, and it's harder to see when you're just walking by it. Some of these details, like the sphinx and the embroidery, I actually only noticed them when I was drawing it. And I've seen this statue many times, probably like at least 10 times, if not more, because, you know, we live in the Bay Area, so go to the De Young often. It's very exciting to see all the folds too. I know when I was younger, I hated folds, I hated drapery, hated doing all this stuff on a character. I was always drawing like comic book characters that were wearing spandex, so I didn't have to do, you know, any of these folds, you know, and I also didn't like to do hair and hairstyles. And I mean, to me, this, like I said, it can go so much further with that hair to go and soften it, and, you know, I'm going to go and do that later and such. But yeah, it's that whole idea of really loving the details and then sort of getting lost in them in a meditative way, and then it becomes fun. But you also have to study it, you know, study it to see how you can figure out how to do it accurately, and then after that, you know, really sort of enjoy working on it instead of turning it into a chore. You know, the more you turn something into a chore, it's going to be a chore. Right, I can see that that shadow behind her arm is even darker. So again, I use some values that are here to gauge other values, right? So I have an anchor value someplace, like in her face and everything, and now I'm using that to make sure I'm bringing up the strength of the values accordingly. I'm not sure I'm crazy about the snake armband here, but so I'm just gonna do it one more time. And this time it's sticking. Depending on the water on your paper, or, you know, just not paying attention, sometimes it can dry off faster or whatever and not spread the right amount. But there we go. Now we've got that going. She's got that beautiful little dimple in her elbow. Kind of feel like I like that this bottom part here is that color, but I want the whole arm there to be sort of receding into that color, going higher up even. So see how I'm sort of like treating the paint like it's a pencil? You just continue to get comfortable with your paint and treat it like you're drawing with a pencil, and a key there really is to have these nylon brushes versus sable in these smaller spots so that the water doesn't get away from you. This is for the cherries that we did this little sheet, but if you look at the wet on dry, that's what I'm doing here. I'm also doing glazes, I'm also doing wet on dry gradients, I'm doing a little bit of wet and wet with, you know, again, it's decreased control versus more control with the wet on dry, and a little bit of dry brush. So these are all the techniques that I usually use in a painting, and when you're doing sort of targeted rendering, you don't want this just constantly get away from you. Where would I want it to get away from me so I have beautiful wet and wet effects? Well, like a background or an abstract passage or looser parts of the hair or a costume where I don't want to render the folds and I just want to get that abstract area. But I don't really want it everywhere, you know? Otherwise I won't be able to accurately render form.
Tell them what you're painting over.
My laptop? Yeah, I always have my laptop right there. This is my laptop right here underneath this. It puts my painting at an angle, and plus it lets me see the photo over there. So I've done.
It's great for catching water.
Yeah, it's a dangerous practice, but I wouldn't advocate that you do so. But for me, it's better than printing out the reference, because for me, I just think to myself, what a waste to print out the reference. I don't even have a printer anymore, so I feel like the best thing you can do for the environment is not to add more waste. So if you have a tablet and you can open up the reference on that, or a large phone, or on your computer, then you can actually zoom in on the reference and, you know, zoom out and do whatever you want, but it's not going to be something that you throw away later, you know, that you've used the ink and you've used the, you know, paper, and then it's only like for that study and then it's gone. And I also, you know, taught people about the proportional divider thing, about how you can use that even holding it up to your computer or your phone, your computer screen, your tablet, whatever. And it makes it a great asset to try to figure out proportions if you're drawing freehand. It's a great tool to help you do freehand. It's the values that really add that punch of realism, so you actually almost lose some of it when you go to add the color. That's why the stronger your value contrast is, the stronger your realism effect will be. This is going to be blue too, so I think I want to do that just to see what happens, and so you guys can see that part of it as a surprise before we go. Just like with the headband up there. And again, I'm keeping a light hand. You don't want to completely mutilate the paint underneath. So people always say, well, how does your paint not move? Don't scour at the paper. You're not going to be able to do glazes anyway, even whether it's grisaille or not, if you're really punching down on the paper. So see how I'm sort of patting down that paint, stroking it in? I'm not really pushing into the paper very hard. I thought about the values separately and I thought about the color separately, and it can really save you some time streaking down and try to find a natural edge. And sometimes it just means you play about with it, you know? It's not written in stone. The statue is not painted in color. It's just a not colored statue, so I have to sort of try to figure out where I want that color. I kind of like how it fades off into a lack of color in some areas, because like I said, it reads as a highlight. But I can also make it darker, the blue, in the shadow areas, and it'll again go into, like, say, this color or that color as a result of having that transparent brown mixed into it. So you kind of know where you're going if you do the color wheel first, which is why I always told people to do that, you know? And I am going to try to cover up more of that Brunaille with this blue, so it gets more of a bluish purple bias to it, because I don't want this brown to be peeking out too much as an identifiable brown in the dress, just because we're going to have it in other places, and I just want it to harmonize underneath there and give me that value touch, but not like, you know. But there you go, that's what the blue is going to look like. And it's much more sedate with mixed in with that versus it being, like I said, just the blue over here. And I could have gone a few different ways, because there isn't like a wrong or a right when you're doing an original piece. It really depends on what mood you decide to end up with in the end. So if I decided to go for a more statuesque mood where I wanted to look more like it was, you know, emulating more of a statue and less of a portrait like I'm painting here, where I'm turning the statue back into a portrait. You know, because like I said, the original, if you look at it, is very different in the face. It's not developed. And I did try to retain in the face that sort of sad, waiting look, you know, that pensive look that I feel like Penelope is iconic for, because she had to wait 20 years for her husband to come back from the Trojan War. It's something that I had to develop the feature a bit more and, you know, develop the eye and the expression. The mouth was the least changed. And the nose, I had to develop the 3 spheres that we can divide it into, develop that a bit more, and also had to develop the expression that I wanted for the eye and the eyebrow, because that doesn't even show up in the sculpture, right? There is like no real detail when it comes to the eye and the eyebrow, so you have to sort of do that, but it adds so much expression to it. But I tried to follow that somber look that she had in general, and I think I need to pick out the tiniest bit of highlight there. It's really hard for this area here, but just that part as it turns around the corner, I wanted to show just a little bit of a highlight in that cheek as it's turning the corner. I've been trying to lift it out, but, you know, it's not so easy. I think I might have gotten it there. It all works in conjunction together. The mood of the piece, the subject of the piece helps you choose your color palette. The color palette will help you choose your underpainting if you have one, because I could have done this in tiling. I very nearly did. And if I did the tiling, there would be no underpainting. I'd be doing the colors and the values at the same time. So we'll be doing the line decor demo like that. So if you want to learn that, very useful to know all those techniques, because you might not always want to paint in glazes. All right, so I think that's probably where I'll stop here, and I will thank everybody for parking your brushes here with me, and wishing you all epic art adventures. And